I just felt like everything was all over the place. But, one person that I know who had it much, much worse than me, who was my good friend, Aaron Onion. And, he was set to, play college sports. He was, a big deal in my high school, was, a huge star, and, looked like everything was going to go good for him in life, and like, in the athletic department. But unfortunately, he suffered way too many concussions and was prevented from playing college sports due to the number of concussions he had sustained. So I interviewed him for this, and I just dove into the deep questions and just asked him what it really felt like to be under such circumstances. But what he told me, you know what probably ended up hurting him more than helping him, is that when he was playing sports and had these concussions, he did not want to stop. He told me, my focus was telling myself I was okay because I just want to keep playing. I just wanted to tell myself I was okay, even though in reality I should have looked at the bigger perspective. And he knows now that he did make a mistake, and he is worried for his future, but he said he does not like to think about it because I even mentioned to him the specific risks of CTE and the fact that he will not know, that he could even have it. So, I mean, that is the scariest thing. But, I just dove into, the type of symptoms he's had, you know, through these very, very severe concussions. And, he said he's had all the typical, known symptoms, but, the scariest he said was when he would just basically black out and pass out. He said, he would just be standing there, and all of a sudden he would just fall, and everything in his mind would go black. And said that he was just terrified and had no clue what to do. And I even witnessed it firsthand, seeing him play in a soccer game where he just collapsed, and he told me that his head was just severely pounding, and he just like couldn't go on anymore. So I mean, it's a very, very scary situation, and it's not one that you would want to put anyone in. So when there is this risk of all these symptoms and the future possibilities of you going mentally insane in the future, why would anyone allow their child to play such scary sports that will have these detrimental effects on their lives forever? These are just absolutely catastrophic injuries, and they need to be prevented. And I think that's why I dove into this specific topic. Obviously, interviewing my friend Aaron Onion was my primary research. The one I chose and felt was most effective for this, just because it really gave me the firsthand insight. I can't find anything better than that. Finding out from someone who has gone through severe concussions in sports and knows exactly what is going on. One huge key finding that I found in my research was while watching the NFL or the film about the NFL called Concussions, in which it dives into basically the story of Dr. Bennett Omalu and his discovering of um, you know CTE in NFL players. But what really stood out to me in this film, it just really took the backdrop of what what CTE was and how it was discovered. But what I found out from it was obviously that you could not find out that CTE was in players while they were alive. Dr. Bennett Amalu had to cut up the brain of former NFL players to diagnose this disease, this mental disease that players had, and that was causing all these suicides, because before that it was unexplained and just unnoted. So this discovering of that was just astronomical to me. But the basic description of what was going on was he showed the brain is basically floating around in basically just a thing of water in your brain. So when you collide with something, it just your brain just boom hits the wall, and there's no protection, there's no out. So that is what causes the CTE. And from the movie, I just really learned that so much of it has come from just the constant collisions and the fact that the NFL covered it up and just did nothing to protect the players. Even the NFL trainers, the team trainers, would write to say that these players were okay to play, and just nothing else to say about it, and that's just unacceptable. Another key finding I found, which is honestly very very crazy because it relates straight to a guy who was born right here in good old Muncie, Indiana, former Chicago Bear Dave Durson. He was a very established and amazing player in the NFL, but following his playing career, he killed himself, and it's happened to a lot of players, and this was just an astonishing fact. But in an article from the New York Times, he, in his suicide note, basically, what was relayed to his family was, according to the source, the next and last message they received from Dave Durson was meant for them, their family, and perhaps all of professional football. It was written in his hurried hand, repeating his text message in case it had not been received, and found in the South Florida condominium, where he placed a gun to his chest and shot himself to death last Thursday. The quote read, "Please see that my brain is given to the NFL's brain bank." So, I mean, he knew that something was wrong with his mind, and his suicide note, he had gone mentally insane from, playing football, and, this note is an explicit, you know, straight up, hey, this is the reality of it. This is what happened to me. If you guys don't change things, this is going to keep happening to players, and it's just unacceptable to see. And so, this was just an eye-opening, thing for me to read. So, just the fact that someone who was completely normal before that can just flip his switch and go mentally insane and lead to killing himself just because he can't take what's going on in his mind anymore is just absolutely ludicrous. Of all the traumatic events that have been caused by playing in the NFL, one good step, to getting to where it is a safer environment has been started. As I have touched on before. But one thing that stood out to me that the NFL has done is, according to the CQ Press article, the quote states, the NFL agreed this summer to pay a total of nearly $1 billion in compensation to former players who suffer from certain neurological disorders. And obviously, that might not, that does seem like a huge number, but the fact that almost every single player who has played in this league has gone through these symptoms and is ultimately going to be affected by it. Personally, I believe that after everything I've looked at and discovered, I just want my research to show to people that these concussions and the risk of CTE is happening at an alarming rate. And I think with my research and my message that will get out to the people who have seen this is that they are going to be very cautious about are they willing to let their own kids play this sport if there aren't improvements because if if you're thinking about your own child, hey, like you don't want to put them at risk, you don't want any possibility of them getting injured, so why throw them into a sport that may kill them, or just make them go mentally insane. And until we see improvements, how much can we trust this sport? So when looking at everything I dove into, it's really important that we are cautious and just make sure that things are going to improve. And like I said, the NFL has made some measures of improvement. Obviously, I mentioned spending $1 billion on player research and helping players with these huge head injuries, and also the rule changes, implementing these rules that prevent from head-to-head contact, and just severe punishments, fines, all the whole enchilada to prevent these very severe head injuries from continuing to happen. But I think that there's still so much more to do until we completely remove and eradicate of all the these severe head injuries. I don't think we should be thinking that this sport is going to be continued, which is kind of sad for huge sports fans, like myself. But when you think about players and just people in general, like human beings, basically just turning their brains into mush, it's unbearable to think about or let happen. But it's just important that this message got out there, and that's why it was such a pressing topic for me to review and research. So I'm very very glad that I was fortunate enough to dive into all this specific detail. Reading on reports from CNN, the Huffington Post, ESPN, very very notable sources to learn about this, and of course the concussion movie, which really dove into the deep deep bones of everything, and that was really what widened my eyes on this whole concussion issue and what exactly what was going on. So I mean, I think it's just very important to get out to the common public, to really know like, hey, this is a scary thing that we need to be cautious of, and if we aren't, there's going to be severe consequences. So I think that's just my biggest goal in this is just people really care about this and make sure there are things changed, and I want things to be changed. But I think from here, the research that I want to be going on from here is, like I said, trying to find, how can we diagnose CTE, without them being dead? Because I know, obviously, we might need technology to improve a little bit because we are not quite there yet. Because the only way of diagnosing it right now is to slice up the brain and everything. But I think it's very, very possible, and it can be done. That we can really, really find out if somebody has CTE um, you know, pre-death, and hopefully one day that leads to finding a diagnose or a solution and diagnosis of this, and just being able to take care of it, like all illnesses. But I mean, I just want to say that it was a very interesting topic to review, and I really hope that all my viewers and audience really take note into this, and just keep their eyes and ears open on this pressing issue. Thank you.